There is a specific kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone. It comes from being in the room with a parent, from sitting across from the person who is supposed to be the safe harbor of your entire childhood and feeling, without being able to name it, that somehow you are the more emotionally capable one in the relationship, that something is being asked of you that should never have been asked of a child, that the adult in the room is not quite fully an adult in the ways that matter most. You could not have named it then. You were a child. Children do not have the language for what is happening in the families they are born into. They only have the felt sense of it, the thing that never quite sat right, the gap between what a parent was supposed to be and what this one actually was. This video is about that gap, about emotionally immature parents, what they are, what they do, and what it does to children who grow up trying to love them and never quite understanding why it always felt like so much work. The term emotionally immature parent comes from psychologist Lindsay Gibson, whose research and clinical work produced one of the most clarifying frameworks in modern relational psychology. Gibson defines emotional immaturity not as a formal diagnosis, but as a recognizable pattern of relating, a way of being in relationship that is governed by the emotional capacities and needs of a much younger developmental stage. The emotionally immature adult has the chronological age of a grown person and the emotional architecture of a child. Not in every domain. They can hold jobs, maintain routines, follow social rules. The immaturity is specifically emotional, in the territory of feelings, needs, vulnerability, conflict, and genuine intimacy. They are operating from a developmental level that was never completed. What does that actually look like? It looks like a parent who makes their own emotions the center of every situation, whose mood sets the tone for the entire household, so that everyone else's energy becomes organized around managing it, who responds to a child distressed not with empathy and presence, but with irritation, dismissal, or by turning the situation back toward themselves. It looks like a parent who cannot tolerate being wrong, whose ego is so fragile that an honest disagreement becomes a threat requiring defense or retaliation, who cannot apologize genuinely, because a genuine apology requires emotional capacity to hold another person's pain as more important than your own discomfort for a moment, and that capacity was never developed. It looks like a parent who is physically present but emotionally absent, who is in the house but not in the relationship, whose attention drifts to their own preoccupations, their phone, their anxieties, their needs, while the child learns to interpret this absence as something about themselves rather than something about the parent. Gibson identifies four broad types of emotionally immature parents. Not rigid categories, but recognizable patterns that often overlap. The first is the emotional parent. This is a parent whose feelings are enormous, unpredictable, and consuming. The household is emotionally chaotic. The child never knows what they are walking into. This parent's distress takes up so much space that the child's own emotional life has nowhere to exist. The child learns to be the regulator, soothing the parent, managing the temperature, keeping things from escalating. The child becomes a tiny therapist for someone who should have been their safe base. The second is the driven parent. This parent is highly functional, highly achieving, perpetually busy. They provide for the family materially. They accomplish things visibly, but they are emotionally unavailable in the way a person is unavailable when the only measure of value they understand is productivity and achievement. The child in this family receives provision, but not presence, resources, but not attunement. They often grow up feeling vaguely guilty for needing something they cannot name, because everything practical was given and nothing emotional was missing in any way they could point to specifically. The third is the passive parent. This parent avoids all conflict, all difficulty, all emotional complexity. They are pleasant and inoffensive and entirely unable to show up for a child in any moment that requires emotional courage. They defer to the more dominant parent. They look away from problems. They are the parent you could not go to with something real, because going to them with something real produced a kind of pleasant, useless helplessness that felt worse than going to no one. The fourth is the rejecting parent. This parent is uncomfortable with closeness, with neediness, with the normal emotional demands of raising a child. They withdraw physically or emotionally when a child needs them. They respond to vulnerability with coldness or criticism. They treat emotional need as an imposition. The child in this family learns to need nothing, to ask for nothing, to make themselves as small and as self-sufficient as possible so as not to trigger the rejection that always seemed to be waiting just behind the parent expression. What matters more than the type is the effect, because the impact on the child is consistent across all four patterns. Even though the surface presentation looks different, the child of an emotionally immature parent learns very early that their inner world, their feelings, their needs, their authentic self, is not welcome in a relationship. It is either too much, too inconvenient, too threatening, or simply irrelevant. And so the child adapts. They develop what Gibson calls an externalizing or internalizing coping style. The externalizing child acts out, becomes a problem child, uses behavior to make visible the pain that the family system cannot acknowledge. The internalizing child goes the other direction. They become the good child, the helper, the one who causes no trouble, the one who suppresses everything and presents a perfectly managed surface while falling apart in private. The internalizing child is often the child nobody worries about because they are so easy, so capable, so apparently fine. They are the child who got the least help precisely because they were most skilled at asking for none. There are specific relational wounds that the emotionally immature parent inflicts not through cruelty, but through incapacity. And naming them is important because many adults who grew up this way have spent years thinking the problem was themselves. The first wound is role reversal. The child becomes the emotional caretaker of the parent. They learn to read the parent's mood, manage the parent's feelings, provide the parent with reassurance, comfort, or entertainment. The parent emotional needs come first, structurally, automatically, as a basic fact of the household. The child's needs are secondary at best, invisible at worst. This is called parentification, and it produces adults who are extraordinarily good at reading and managing other people's emotional states, and extraordinarily bad at identifying and expressing their own. The second wound is the invisible self. Because the child's genuine inner life was consistently either dismissed or unsafe to express, the child learns to hide it, not just from the parent, eventually from themselves. The authentic self, the part that has real feelings, real preferences, real needs, goes underground. What remains visible is a performed self, a version of the person that was shaped by what the family required rather than who the person actually is. This is why so many adults who grew up with emotionally immature parents arrive in midlife or adulthood with a strange, disorienting experience of not knowing who they are, not in the identity crisis sense. In the quieter, more specific sense of genuinely not being sure what they feel, what they want, what they need, or what they think about things when no one else's reaction is factored in. The third wound is the chronic misattunement. Attunement is the experience of being emotionally felt by another person, of having your inner state registered, reflected, and responded to in a way that makes you feel seen and understood. Children need attunement from caregivers the way they need food and water. It is not optional. It is developmental nutrition. The emotionally immature parent cannot provide consistent attunement because attunement requires genuine attention to someone else's inner state, and their own inner state is too consuming, too defended, or too absent for that to be possible. The child raised with chronic misattunement often grows into an adult who does not quite trust their own perceptions, who second-guesses their feelings, who finds it difficult to name what is happening internally, because the experience of having internal states acknowledged and named was so inconsistently available in childhood. There is a particular dynamic that appears in almost every adult relationship of the person raised by an emotionally immature parent, and it causes enormous pain before it is understood. They keep trying to get the parent to finally see them, not always from the actual parent, often from partners, from friends, from authority figures, from anyone who carries emotional charge of significance. There is a deep, persistent longing, not always conscious, for the experience that was never provided in childhood, the experience of being genuinely met, of matching to someone in a way that does not require the suppression of your real self. And because this longing is old and powerful and attached to the original relationship, it keeps seeking resolution in current relationships. Relationships that often have their own dynamics and their own limitations and their own incapacity to provide what the original parent could not. The pattern repeats. The longing remains unmet, and the person blames themselves or the partner or their own unfixable neediness. not understanding that what they are experiencing is the unresolved grief of a childhood relationship that never gave them what they needed and never will. Gibson calls this the healing fantasy, the unconscious belief that if you are good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, the parent will eventually become capable of the relationship you needed, that the recognition will come, that the love will finally feel like love. The healing fantasy is understandable. It is also one of the most quietly destructive psychological patterns a person can carry, because it keeps the person oriented toward a source that cannot provide, waiting for something from someone who does not have it to give, instead of building the relationships and the self-understanding that could provide what they actually need. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of something important, not hatred of the parent, not permanent rupture, not the transformation of complicated love into clean contempt. It is the beginning of grief. The grief for what was not provided. The grief for the childhood that was shaped around a parent's limitations rather than the child's needs. The grief for the version of yourself that went underground because it was not safe to exist fully. And alongside the grief, something else begins. The slow, patient work of locating the self that was hidden, of learning to ask what do you actually feel and waiting long enough for an honest answer, of building the capacity, in present relationships, to be seen and to stay seen, rather than performing the managed version that learned to keep the peace in a household where the peace had to be kept. The child who took care of everyone else's feelings deserves to have their own feelings taken care of, not by the parent who could not, but by the life they are building now. The self that went underground to survive is not gone. It is waiting for the conditions that make it safe to surface.